Johnny Carson was the king of late-night television for 30 years. Behind that charming smile and quick wit, he had to deal with all kinds of guests. Some made him laugh, others made him think, but a few made him grit his teeth and count the minutes. These are the 8 guests that Johnny Carson reportedly couldn't stand. And to kick off this list is Bob Hope. Johnny Carson and Bob Hope might have been 2 comedy legends, but behind the scenes, their relationship was far from friendly. Carson enjoyed natural, spontaneous conversations with his guests. He liked it when people could go off script and talk about things that felt real and in the moment. Bob Hope, on the other hand, wasn't that kind of guest. According to Andrew Nichols, who once worked as Carson's head writer, Hope depended completely on his team of writers. Every line he said was planned ahead of time. Bob always came with a script. Nichols once said, Johnny liked guests who lived in the real world and could talk freely. With Bob, there wasn't much to say. As time went on, Carson became less and less excited to have Hope on the show. Hope's appearances felt stiff and forced. He would only respond to questions that had been agreed on beforehand. If Carson asked something out of order, Hope would get confused and give the wrong answer. After one particularly dull interview in the 1980s, Carson reportedly turned to his staff and said, "If I ever get like that, just shoot me." Their awkward dynamic wasn't just limited to the studio. Off-stage, there was a quiet rivalry. Hope, being older, saw himself as the senior figure and seemed to think Carson needed guidance. At Ronald Reagan's first presidential inauguration, both men were invited to perform. Even though Carson had the bigger spot in the lineup, Hope approached him with a few joke suggestions. "Here, Johnny," he said, handing over a few pages. "Maybe you can use these." Carson smiled and said, "Thanks, Bob. That's kind of you, but I've got everything ready." But once Hope walked away, Carson was furious. "Can you believe that? He thinks I need his jokes?" Even with their differences, NBC kept putting Hope front and center. When Carson moved The Tonight Show to California, he took over a studio originally built for Hope. Still, Hope had special rights. He could appear on the show anytime he wanted to promote something. Carson wasn't happy about it, but saying no to Hope wasn't an option. But Hope's rigid style was just the beginning of Carson's guest troubles. Speaking of performers who played by their own rules, that brings us to a man who never met a rule he couldn't break. Frank Sinatra, the legend who treated every room like his own personal stage. When Old Blue Eyes walked into The Tonight Show, ratings went through the roof. The man was pure magnetism, and audiences couldn't get enough of him. But behind the scenes, Johnny Carson learned what everyone else in Hollywood already knew. Frank Sinatra didn't just sing My Way, he lived it. Sinatra was used to being the boss wherever he went. Hotel managers, movie directors, record executives, they all bent over backward to keep him happy. And he expected the same treatment from Carson. What? The problem was, The Tonight Show was Johnny's kingdom, and he wasn't used to sharing power. The most famous example happened during a live taping. Carson was in the middle of his monologue, hitting his stride with the audience, when suddenly Frank Sinatra walked right out onto the stage. No warning, no cue from the producers, nothing. He just strolled out and interrupted Johnny mid-joke. The crowd went absolutely wild. They loved the spontaneity, the surprise of seeing Sinatra appear out of nowhere. But Carson, he kept smiling and played along like the professional he was. But inside, he was steaming. That kind of power move might have worked in Vegas, but this was Carson's show. Then there were the demands. Sinatra traveled with an entourage that made rock stars look modest. Last-minute changes to the show's format, special seating arrangements, specific lighting requirements. The list went on and on. Every Sinatra appearance turned into a major production, and Carson, who valued order and control, found it exhausting. Don't get it wrong. Carson respected Sinatra's talent immensely. How could he not? But having him as a guest meant giving up control of his own show. And that never sat well with the man who had spent decades perfecting the art of being the perfect host. While Sinatra brought chaos through star power, our next guest brought a different kind of challenge, one that made Carson squirm in his chair for entirely different reasons. Harry Belafonte. Johnny Carson had nothing but respect for Harry Belafonte. The man was a triple threat: singer, actor, and humanitarian. His voice was magic, his screen presence undeniable, and his commitment to civil rights was inspiring. But when Belafonte sat down on The Tonight Show, Carson often found himself in uncharted waters. Most guests came on the show with a simple goal: entertain the audience. They would tell funny stories, promote their latest project, maybe sing a song. Light, breezy, perfect for late-night television. But Belafonte had bigger things on his mind. He came to The Tonight Show to talk about civil rights, social justice, and the problems facing America. When Belafonte spoke about inequality, about the struggles of African Americans, about his work with various humanitarian causes, the studio would fall silent. Not because people weren't interested, but because the weight of his words didn't match the usual tone of the show. The Tonight Show was America's bedtime story, a place where people came to unwind after a long day. Heavy social commentary, no matter how important, didn't always fit. Carson found himself caught in an impossible position. Crack a joke, and he would look insensitive. Change the subject, and he would seem disrespectful. So he would nod along, ask thoughtful questions when he could, and try to find a way back to lighter ground. But with Belafonte, the conversation always stayed serious. The awkwardness wasn't personal. Both men respected each other, but their goals were different. Belafonte wanted to use his platform to create change and awareness. Carson wanted to send people to bed with a smile. Sometimes those two missions just couldn't coexist comfortably. While Belafonte challenged Carson intellectually, our next guest presented a more direct threat, one that left the usually unflappable host genuinely shaken. He is Wayne Newton, the Vegas showman who brought the confrontation backstage. For years, Johnny Carson treated Wayne Newton like a running joke. Newton's high voice, his flashy sequined outfits, his over-the-top Vegas persona, it was all perfect material for Carson's sharp wit. Night after night, Johnny would throw out one-liners about Mr. Las Vegas, and the audience would eat it up. It seemed harmless enough. After all, everyone in show business got roasted by Carson at some point. But Wayne Newton wasn't laughing. While most celebrities understood that Carson's jokes were part of the late-night game, Newton took them personally. He felt like Carson was damaging his reputation, making him look like a joke instead of the serious entertainer he considered himself to be. The jokes stung, and Newton decided he'd had enough. According to people who were there, Newton showed up at Carson's office unannounced one day. He walked in and made it clear that the jokes needed to stop. Now the exact words exchanged remain private, but everyone who knew both men understood this wasn't a friendly conversation. Newton, despite his soft-spoken stage persona, could be intimidating when he wanted to be. Carson, who was used to being the one in control, was reportedly shaken by the confrontation. He had spent decades making fun of everyone, from politicians to movie stars, and no one had ever marched into his office to demand he stop. The jokes about Wayne Newton ended almost immediately, but the damage was done. Newton continued to appear on The Tonight Show occasionally, but the dynamic had changed completely. The easy banter was gone, replaced by forced smiles and awkward small talk. Carson might have kept things professional on camera, but behind the scenes, he never forgot that confrontation, and he never quite forgave it either. If Newton brought tension through confrontation, our next guest brought chaos through pure unpredictability. Meet Shelley Winters. Some guests made Johnny Carson laugh, others made him think, but Shelley Winters made him brace for impact. Every time she walked onto the Tonight Show stage, you could practically see Carson's shoulders tense up, because with Shelley, absolutely anything could happen. Winters was an Academy Award-winning actress with serious dramatic chops, but she was also completely, utterly unpredictable. She would interrupt Carson mid-sentence, go off on wild tangents, completely ignore his attempts to steer the conversation, and generally treat the interview like her own personal therapy session. Carson thrived on the rhythm of good conversation. He was a master at guiding discussions, setting up jokes, and making his guests look good. But Winters didn't follow anyone's lead. She was pure chaos in designer clothes, and Carson never knew if she was going to tell a heartwarming story about her childhood or suddenly start crying about her latest romantic disaster. The most famous example happened during a taping when Winters literally took off her shoe and handed it to Carson, just like that. No explanation, no context, nothing. The audience laughed because they thought it was planned, but Carson's face told the real story. He was completely bewildered, holding a woman's high heel and having no idea what to do with it. What made it worse was that Winters seemed to genuinely believe she was being entertaining. She would dominate the conversation, interrupt other guests, and generally turn what should have been a smooth talk show segment into a one-woman show, and not necessarily a good one. Carson was too much of a professional to show his frustration on camera, but people who worked on the show knew the truth. When Shelley Winters was booked, it wasn't going to be an interview. It was going to be an endurance test. While Winters brought chaos through sheer unpredictability, our next guest presented a different challenge, one that left Carson feeling completely out of his element. He was none other than Fred Rogers, the man who made kindness feel awkward on late-night television. This one might surprise people. Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, was one of the most beloved figures in American television. He spent decades teaching children about kindness, empathy, and understanding. He was gentle, thoughtful, and genuinely caring in a world that often rewarded the opposite. But when he sat across from Johnny Carson, something strange happened. Kindness became uncomfortable. Carson was a master of wit, sarcasm, and playful teasing. His guests usually came ready to trade jokes, tell funny stories, and engage in the kind of light banter that made for great television. But Rogers wasn't there to entertain in the traditional sense. He wanted to talk about feelings, about helping children, about making the world a better place. And that's beautiful. But it didn't exactly make for exciting late-night TV. Carson found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't joke with Rogers the way he did with other guests. It would have made him look mean-spirited. He couldn't tease him or poke fun without seeming like a bully picking on America's favorite neighbor. So he would sit there nodding politely, asking sincere questions, and trying to match Rogers' gentle energy. But it never quite worked. Rogers didn't laugh just to be polite. He didn't play the Hollywood game of mutual back-scratching. He spoke slowly, thoughtfully, and with a kind of earnest sincerity that was wonderful in children's television, but felt strangely out of place in Carson's rapid-fire world. The interviews weren't disasters, but they were awkward. Two good men from completely different worlds, trying to connect and not quite managing it. Carson respected Rogers immensely, but having him on the show was like trying to tell jokes at a meditation retreat. The energy just didn't match. While Rogers brought discomfort through his gentle sincerity, our next guest brought a different kind of tension, the kind that comes from taking yourself too seriously. If you guessed Charlton Heston, then you're right. Charlton is that Hollywood legend who treated every conversation like a history lesson. He was movie royalty. Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, Planet of the Apes. The man had been the leading man in some of the biggest films ever made. When he walked onto the Tonight Show stage, he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had literally played Moses and Michelangelo. The problem was, he never stopped being those characters. Carson was used to celebrities who could laugh at themselves, who could be playful and light even while promoting serious projects. But Heston was always on in a very particular way. He was formal, serious, and spoke as if he were addressing the Roman Senate rather than a late-night television audience. Ask him about a movie, and he would launch into a detailed explanation of the historical significance of the story. Ask him about working with other actors, and he would give you a lecture on the craft of performance. Everything was weighty, everything was important, everything was delivered with the kind of dramatic gravity that worked great on the big screen but felt heavy on late-night TV. Carson liked flow and rhythm in his conversations. He wanted guests who could go from serious to silly and back again without missing a beat. But with Heston, every topic seemed to require a full dramatic monologue. There was no lightness, no casual banter, no easy laugh. Later in his career, when Heston became heavily involved in politics and gun rights advocacy, the interviews became even more challenging. Carson generally avoided controversial political topics on his show, preferring to keep things light and entertaining. But Heston had strong opinions and wasn't shy about sharing them, which put Carson in the uncomfortable position of either engaging in political debate or trying to steer the conversation elsewhere. The tension wasn't explosive, but it was definitely there. Two legends with completely different styles, trying to make television magic and never quite succeeding. Carson kept things professional, but you could tell he was working harder than usual just to keep the conversation moving. Speaking of guests who brought the wrong energy to the show, our final entry takes us to someone who made Carson feel like he was being challenged for his own throne. He is Chevy Chase. In the mid-1970s, Chevy Chase was comedy's golden boy. He had helped launch Saturday Night Live. His sarcastic humor was cutting edge, and he was starring in hit movies. He was young, talented, and confident, maybe too confident. When Chase appeared on The Tonight Show, something felt off from the very beginning. Most comedians came on Carson's show with a sense of respect, even gratitude. After all, an appearance with Johnny could make or break a career, but Chase seemed to think he was doing Carson a favor by showing up. Carson was a master at making his guests look good. He would set up their jokes, laugh at their stories, and generally make sure everyone came out looking great. But with Chase, the usual dynamic didn't work. Instead of playing along with Carson's rhythm, Chase seemed more interested in showing off his own wit, often at Carson's expense. There was an underlying competition in their interactions that made everyone uncomfortable. While most guests were happy to let Carson be the star of his own show, Chase seemed to think he could do the job just as well, if not better. And maybe he wasn't entirely wrong. He was talented, quick-witted, and had great timing. But that wasn't the point. The tension was made worse by industry rumors that Chase had ambitions in late-night television. Whether or not he actually wanted Carson's job, the perception was there, and Carson could feel it. Having someone on your show who might be eyeing your chair while sitting in it created an undercurrent of competition that made genuine conversation nearly impossible. Chase's appearances always looked fine on the surface. Both men were too professional to let their personal feelings completely derail the show. But those who knew Carson well could see the signs, the slightly forced smile, the quicker-than-usual pace, the subtle relief when the segment ended. For a man who had spent decades making difficult conversations look easy, having Chevy Chase on the show was like performing a balancing act on a tightrope. Technically successful, but exhausting for everyone involved. So, here you have it. Johnny Carson was a master of his craft, but even masters have their limits. The fascinating thing is that most of these guests were talented, successful people who were probably wonderful in other contexts. But late-night television is its own special art form, and not everyone could master the particular rhythm that made The Tonight Show work. Carson's genius was in making it all look easy, even when dealing with guests who made his job anything but simple. In the end, these difficult guests probably made Carson a better host. They forced him to adapt, to find new ways to manage challenging situations, and to maintain his professional demeanor even when he wanted to run screaming from the studio. They were the sand in the oyster that helped create the pearl of Carson's legendary career.